Christopher Bro, better known as Frank Ocean, wakes up in the middle of the night in a panic. He quickly rushes to his neighbor's door, waking him up in hopes to play him some new records he's working on for his upcoming album.
What?
He's on a mission to create a masterpiece. This is how Frank Ocean made Blonde. Most people don't know that it was the reception from his Grammy performance that pushed Frank to start making his sophomore album.
Frank sucked, and I was like, oh, he did? I thought it was pretty good.
I told him, I was like, yo, that shit was tight. And he's like, oh, you're being sarcastic, asshole.
Oh, so he thought he didn't do a good job?
He told me he thought it could have been better and stuff.
This drama would be the start of his hostile relationship with the Recording Academy, aka the Scammies. After that night, Frank flew in high-profile producers, artists, and sound engineers from all over the world. One of these engineers is Frank's go-to guy, Jeff Ellis. Jeff has worked with Frank Ocean since Channel Orange, and he has given us some insight on Frank's creative process. Just like his music, Frank is a very free spirit when he's creating. He doesn't have a set and specific way of working. Mostly, he does jam sessions with different instrumentalists and producers in the room. They'll jam while he tracks down his ideas on a handheld mic. He doesn't wait until he's in the booth. An engineer at Abbey Road Studios also spoke on the creative process behind the album and said Frank and his collaborators were working to create a new world with no rules. Early on in the process, Frank would quietly move to London. While in London, he'd start working with James Blake, and eventually they became really good friends. Fortunately for us, their friendship led to some great records that ended up on Blonde. In May 2016, James Blake released his album The Color in Anything and stated that Frank was a major influence for the project. James actually interpolated the song Godspeed on this project before Blonde came out, and this is what he had to say about it. It's an interpolation of a song that he wrote that hasn't come out yet. It was nice of him to let me use it. Further on in the interview, he would hint at him and Frank having a bunch more songs, but that he wasn't sure what would actually end up being on Frank's sophomore. A lot of artists try to manufacture an aura of mystery that surrounds them, but Frank really is that guy. Very few people knew about his plans for this project, even some of his closest collaborators. Andre 3000 himself did not know he was on the album until he pressed play.
I was actually in California and I heard that Frank was doing this event where he was releasing his magazine, Boys Don't Cry. And the album Blonde was actually in the magazine, so we ride home and we put the Blonde CD in, and then my voice comes on. Out of nowhere, like, he didn't tell us that it was coming out.
And what he heard sounded nothing like what Frank had first sent him.
2 or 3 years before Blonde came out, he sent me a beat and we kept back and forth. He was sending me beats, we were listening to music, and I did this verse to this beat. It was like a hip hop kind of beat, and actually it was completely different from what I laid it down to. This whole beat, he took my verse from that beat and then had it. It was the genius of Frank. He put it on piano alone, no beat, just me and the piano.
In the final version, he ended up swapping out the beat for James Blake's majestic chords on the piano, but it sounds so flawless you'd think 3 Stacks recorded his verse over the final version of the beats.
Me and James Blake in the studio one day, and he was like, you know, that was me playing piano under your verse. And I was like, what?
I pulled up on Ye in search of help for Lovesick, like, yo, what should I do? He looked at James Blake, he's like, James Blake has all the chords.
By the way, if you want to purchase the beats that you hear on this video and on this channel, just send me an email at geekboutit@gmail.com. James Blake shows up again on Solo as co-producer, and initially it was believed he had also helped write White Ferrari, but when the album's liner notes were released, this was proven not to be true. Okay, we have to talk about White Ferrari, which in my opinion is top 5 in Frank's whole discography. In November 2015, the renowned producer A-Track put out a tweet that read, "In a few weeks you'll hear a song called White Ferrari. I can't tell you who it's by, but it's the best thing you'll hear this year." And even though we didn't know this at the time, Rostam, who was working on Blonde, replied with a simple, "Yep." It didn't take long for some diehard Frank fans to start putting 2 and 2 together. They figured since he had an affinity for cars, surely he had to be involved somehow. And crazy enough, they weren't wrong. This photo of Frank standing in front of a chalkboard further increased the speculations as they saw that Rari was written on the board. Later that year, Frank would reveal that White Ferrari had about 50 different versions, but he wouldn't stop tweaking it until he made something that gave him peace. And until it felt right, he wasn't satisfied. This was his mindset for the whole album. For months on end, Frank was tucked away at Abbey Road Studios, working 16-hour shifts. And in the midst of this process, Frank's frequent collaborator, Omar Keith, revealed to the world just how hard Frank was working to complete this album. He was working with lesser established artists like Austin Feinstein, and also the likes of Kanye and Mike Dean, to name a few. Even though there aren't any credited features on the tracklist, a lot of heavy hitters were around for the creation of Blonde. As we all know, Beyonce provided her angelic harmonies and background vocals on Pink and White, which is produced by Pharrell. Both Beyonce and Skateboard P have been huge supporters of Frank since their first few listens of his music.
And this guy's tone and his lyrics just touched me, and after one song, I said, okay, who is that? Because I want them on a flight tonight. And he told me it was Frank Ocean. And I immediately reached out, and he came in the next day, and we did like 5 or 6 songs. Really, really talented, very fast. He just has so many ideas.
Frank Ocean is incredible. We met at Coachella. I told him, man, I like what you do, let's do something. And then we ended up working. He's super talented.
Now, I personally remember how excited I was in 2015 when Chance the Rapper shared this photo of him and Frank. This was before Chance was about to drop Coloring Book, and I had my fingers crossed, praying for a Frank feature. And while that didn't happen, Chance at least filled us in on Frank's movements and his highly anticipated music. In an interview with Fader, Chance spoke about him and Frank hanging out in LA. He even bragged about how he had a girl over at his mansion, and Frank just randomly started playing the piano in the background whilst overlooking the sunset. Then in 2016, in a Complex interview, Chance revealed an artist named Francis and the Lights would have an appearance on Frank's upcoming project. This gave us a better idea of what Frank's vocals were going to sound like, because Francis has a very unique vocal manipulator that he calls the Prismizer. We banged out Close to You relatively quickly. We then worked on Self-Control for the rest of the time. He wanted me to try making completely different chords for Self-Control, so I did that for many hours. When the final version came out, the vocal was the same as I had heard, but the music was completely different and I never heard it before. Close to You on Blonde, however, was almost exactly the same as we had left it that night. And of course, we also got this famous tweet from Chance. A super unexpected feature we got, which ended up being acclaimed, was Young Lean. And I won't lie, I didn't know it was Young Lean singing on Self-Control until I looked properly through the credits. While buying drugs in his home country, he got a call and a request from Frank to join him in London.
Hello, Young Lean. Do you know who this is? Like, no, who's this? Frank Ocean. I would love to have you come over to London and record with me. I'm like, we had dinner. We had Indian spicy dinner and watched the Dictator. Me, Mike Dean, and Frank Ocean.
Mike actually plays a very important part of the creation, and most importantly, the finishing touches of Blonde. Since he was mastering the album, he was one of the very few people who knew of Frank's solid plans to drop it. Travis Scott's A&R and legendary mixtape DJ Sycamore revealed a funny story about him being present when Mike was delivered the album for him to master.
He mastered Frank Ocean's album in the middle of Birds, right?
Wow, Blonde? The Blonde album?
Blonde, yeah.
Wow.
And I was like sitting on the couch while like the guy comes in with like a briefcase of like Frank Ocean's like album. Wow. And I'm hearing like a little bit of Blonde in like the other room. I'm kind of like, you know, like poking my head out like, oh, this is crazy. Like, you're hearing a Frank
Top
Ocean
secret
album.
shit,
Right.
yeah.
And that was like a Wednesday, and it came out Saturday, you know? It's probably the illest experience I've ever seen watching him finish an album. Because you go watch him in the house and playing like the guitar, the keys, smoking a blunt on the computer, all at the same time.
That must have been so surreal to be in the room with Mike Dean while he finishes this highly anticipated album that nobody had any clear information on at the time. At that point, we all thought that the album name was Boys Don't Cry, which was completely wrong. While Boys Don't Cry became a working title amongst the media and fans, in reality, Blonde was unnamed until weeks prior to its release. Eventually, when it was released, Blonde sent the whole world into a frenzy. Every line was being dissected by fans, theories were conjured up. And because the album first came out without any liner notes and credits, it left people to create their own assumptions and deductions. For example, many people believe Kendrick Lamar appeared on the song Skyline 2, which wasn't true at all. What I did find interesting though was this demo version of Nights, which had a Kendrick verse on it.
What's our philosophy? Ooh, nanny.
But still, I'm glad it didn't make the final cut because I think Frank executed it the way it was supposed to be done. Recently, after the Coachella saga, we saw a lot of people talking about how Frank doesn't care about his fans and how he started thinking his shit doesn't stink. And while I don't approve of how he handled Coachella, I don't necessarily think this is the case. Similarly to the pressure he felt after Channel Orange, he probably feels double the amount every time he thinks about following up Blonde. He's in competition with his greatest work, and anything that isn't better than Blonde will be called a flop instantly. He's apparently paralyzed under the expectation to put together a classic. It's very easy to fall victim to one's own success. And we do know he's been working on music because of the songs and music video he leaked off to Coachella.
From your perspective, without giving away his process, how was it influential to you working with Frank Ocean?
I think he is very free in the way he creates. That's always beautiful and inspiring.
When the music is right, I'm sure we'll get the album that he wants us to live with.